thought it would seem odd. Hi, everyone. I'm glad that people got the link. That's
Yeah,
good. I hope everyone got the link. I guess we'll find out pretty soon if anyone hasn't got it.
yeah.
My phone will blow up.
So I guess for those of you in the chat, how did you get the book? I'm kind of curious since for those of you who are here already, did you get a Kindle version or an electronic version? Did you get it on paper or is it hardback and paperback or is it just paperback?
It's hardback for now, and then the paperback comes out probably in a year's time-ish.
Well, mine's paperback, right? So pre-ordered the paper
Oh, you
book,
got
hard
an
copy.
Yeah, that's because you got a special version.
Yeah, I know. It's very nice. I'll get you to put your name in it when I see you next.
I just show that,
Um,
I go to a dep in New York, like a convenience store across from where I work every night or so, and get some bottles of mineral water. And I
yeah.
talked to the girl that works there, the young lady that works there, and she only speaks French. She doesn't speak English, but I always managed to have a conversation with her. And I had this book in my hand today, and I said, "Oh, my book came out today," and she was kind of confused. And so when I showed her at the back, I went, "C'est moi," like that. And she
Yeah.
kind of showed, she like dropped something that was in her hand and went, "Oh shit."
Yeah,
Like,
nice.
it's like that's kind of funny. And then she went, "Oh, sorry." And I was like, "Yeah, I wrote this book." So I guess that took her by surprise for some reason.
So the hardback will be in stores today or tomorrow, or
Well, weirdly, I mean, it's meant to be in stores today, but a lot of people have already been buying it, so it's obviously already in some shops. Yeah, a lot of
mm,
people had it before I did. Well, some people had it before I did.
well, we know at least somebody who had it before you
At
did, because
least
that's
one
how you got
person
yours. That's right.
had it before I did. So I'm glad that people have got it though, and they're kind of reading it. I'm glad that people have got the audiobook because that's my favorite format of all of all the formats between hardback, paperback, ebook, and audiobook. Audiobook is my favorite
Now, why is it your favorite?
because it's kind of because I do the narration, so it's because I get paid twice. Like
That's right.
that's good,
Yeah.
but also because I quite like the experience of going in the recording studio and doing it. And I guess you if you put a lot of effort into something, then you think, well, like if I get to read it, I can maybe put a little bit more emphasis or a little bit more emotion into the words, and then I feel like I'm doing a better job of presenting what it was that I was trying to say, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, I feel like you'll always get the pronunciation right. And the other thing is you will put the emphasis in the right place. And that's kind of a cool thing because I hear that sometimes in narration where people don't. By the way, I'm going to turn off the beep for us here in a minute.
And some people, I see, I have an audio. They go through a whole palaver about the pronunciation, right? We have a list of 254 Greek words with phonetic pronunciations, and then the Greek script. And then I have my friend Lalia who coaches me. And then we have an audio director and a sound engineer with a thing in front of them. And they always pull me up on my pronunciation of English words.
Oh, is that right? Yeah, that's
Yeah.
funny.
So what were the so what is it? I said wrath, and my audio director said that she thinks it should be wrath, and I was like, I'm pretty sure it could be
She's
either,
British. Yeah.
right? And also because I'm British and Canadian, so that confuses my pronunciation a bit. So sometimes I pronounce things the American way, sometimes I pronounce it the British way, and then sometimes the sound engineer or the audio director of British or American or English or whatever, it's like, makes things a bit different. What was the other? I said for my entire life, I've been saying bestial. Was it? I can't remember what way around I got it now. I said bestial or bestial. Like
Yeah. But
bestial. I
not
said
the way they
bestial. It's
liked it.
bestial. Like it's bestial, isn't it? I pronounced that
Yeah.
wrong somehow. But the Greek words they said I managed to pronounce. But the
So
problem
let
that
me
I
ask you
have,
this question. You said
yeah,
Lauya helped you with that.
yeah,
So were you going for Attic or Koine or modern Greek when you did the Greek pronunciations, or what was she doing?
we were typically often actually what we chose to do was the kind of anglicized pronunciation of a lot of
Gotcha.
ancient Greek
Sure.
words. And what I tend to do sometimes is confuse ancient and modern Greek a bit. Like, so that when I first went to Greece, I was pronouncing things in ancient Greek and people would look really weird at me, like I was speaking Elizabethan English or something. And so I
Right.
gradually I got out of that habit. And now when I have to read ancient Greek, sometimes like one example would be Aspasia. I would, I'm in the habit of pronouncing Aspasia, which
Uh,
is the way it would be
right.
pronounced in modern Greek. But in a
Right.
way, it doesn't matter, right? Because there's more than one way to pronounce these things. So
Yeah.
that's the kind of fun and games that we have over dinner and things in Athens, trying to figure out why I'm pronouncing. And then there's other things that I'm sure I am pronouncing right, but Lalia's just convinced that I don't. There's certain vowels that I pronounce too short because I'm Scottish,
Yeah.
uh, and I just never seem to be able to pronounce properly. To
Nice. All right. So we got a crowd here, or some folks kind of rolling in. Tell us. So in the chat, I know. Listen, we've made this easy. You don't have to worry about what you look like. We don't have your video up. I don't. Where's my copy? It's over on the other
got
table.
it
Maybe
somewhere.
I'll get it when we're not talking.
I mean, I haven't even
Um,
looked at this properly, Phil. There's pictures of
I well,
things.
I've carried mine around because I want people to see me with your book out in
It's
the
got
wild. So look at
like a
that.
picture there of
Uh,
Socrates. It's got a map.
yeah.
There was a lot of debate about the map as well.
Mm. All right, so let me give instructions to the audience for a
Yeah.
second. Like I said, we made it easy for you. You can kind of lean back and watch Donald talk, which is what most of this is going to be about. But why don't you, in the chat, tell us where you are? Just kind of give us a sense of where you are in the world, because I think it's kind of fun. And if you've got it already, I see some folks have already put in that they've got it on Audible or they've got it on the Kindle or hard copy or whatever. I've personally, I've got the paperback and the Kindle version, and today the Audible
Multiple.
version dropped.
Oh, wow.
I so one of the things I like to do, by the way, while we're waiting people to stick this inside the chat, is I am one of those cats that really likes the whisper sync thing. So there are times where
Right?
I will listen to the narration while I have the book in my hand, or sometimes the
Really?
Kindle. But
I've never tried
I
that. I've heard of it. I've heard it spoken of in hushed tones. Like, or I've seen it on the
yeah,
internet. That's how it works? How exactly does it work, Phil? Whisper Sync.
it's
Give us all
fantastic.
a
It
tutorial on
is
it.
fantastic because one of the things you can do if you've got a book that's all whisper synced up, right, is
Uh-huh.
that you can listen to the Audible version. You close that book, put your phone away, wherever, and pick up your Kindle. And when you pick it up, it will actually pick up exactly where you left off in the
Right.
Audible.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And but I get, like I said, sometimes when I really, really want to concentrate or there's some point I'm trying to get, I'll say, okay, hold on a second here. I'm going to do both at the same time. So put my headphones on, I'll have the Audible version playing, and then I'll read it inside there. All right, listen, we got folks from Canada, Morgantown, West Virginia, the Netherlands, Sacramento, California, Ontario,
Man,
Canada. I know my pal
Netherlands
Larry's in
again.
Boston, even though he doesn't know how to spell it. Budapest, uh, California, Florida. You have people from all over who are eager to hear from you.
I
Um,
wonder if there's anyone from Greece or
is there
Montreal
anybody?
or Scotland.
Well, this is a little, this is not a great time for folks in Greece at the moment.
That's true. It's probably the middle
There's,
of the night or something, is it?
yeah,
Time visiting
Montreal.
Greece.
We have some Montreal here. So there are
That's
people
good.
in your town hanging out with you. Okay.
Excellent.
I'm
Right.
gonna tell you what I want to do. So you said we're gonna take if you're gonna take questions after you've done whatever it is you're gonna do, and I really have no idea what you're going to do, but that's okay. You'll figure that out, and I'll figure it out as you do it. In as for the audience goes, two things. By the way, every once in a while someone says, "Hey, the chat, I find the chat a little bit distracting." And there's a button inside the chat that says show chat previews. And if you turn that off, then the chat just becomes a little number and it doesn't pop up while Donald is talking. So if you like that, you can do that, and that's fun. Inside the chat, again, tell us where you are, ask questions about the book, support Donald and each other in this space. Let's not run something else while we're at it. And he's going to take questions at the end. And I think that's going to probably end up being you type a question and then we'll speak it out loud or something in here like this rather than have you guys worry with that later. So Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Donald J. Robertson. And Donald is a cognitive behavioral therapist. He is the author of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. I'm going to guess
Yeah.
lots of you have read that book. Maybe some of you came to your Stoicism through that way. But he is now the author of How to Think Like Socrates. Today is the launch, and you are here for that. And you'll be able to tell people I was in the room when this happened. So, with that, thank you. And we can't even see them applaud, but I'm going to applaud you. They can applaud inside the chat. Donald, thank you for doing this. I'm looking forward to what you've got to say today. I'm going to get out of the
Well,
way, and it's all you.
thank you very much, Phil, for offering to help us out today. It wouldn't be the same without you here, my friend, and everything that you bring to the event. And thanks everyone for joining us today for this little online book launch for How to Think Like Socrates. I just got back from the bookstore Indigo in Montreal, and they had a bunch of copies. So that's kind of the first time that I've seen them in a bookstore. So it's kind of satisfying. I've been working this for about a year and a half. So it's quite a long journey, and then you get to see your book out in the wild. It's quite satisfying. So what am I going to do? Well, we're going to take some questions from people in a bit. But before we do that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the book. And really, I'm just going to kind of go through each section of it and say a little bit about each one, because I thought that might be a kind of fun way of doing it. So, first of all, I was going to say some things really just about how I started doing this in the first place. I was a weird kid and read ancient philosophy when I was like 16 or 17 or something like that. And I read Plato, as far as I can remember, it's a long time ago now. I read Plato's Republic, the Apology, the Phaedo, the Symposium, and also this book that was like a collection of excerpts. I remember reading that in the garden one summer. And that was kind of what got me interested in philosophy. I was reading a lot of other things at the time. Then I went to Aberdeen University and I did my philosophy degree there, 4 years in Scotland. And I studied Plato and Aristotle at university. So I studied the Theaetetus in particular at university way back in the early 90s. So that was like 3 decades ago. And then I became a psychotherapist and I became interested in Stoicism. So it's taken me a long time to kind of get round to writing this book. And I wanted to write it because I see Socrates in some ways as kind of like the great granddaddy of Stoicism and the great granddaddy of modern cognitive psychotherapy in particular, a lot of modern self-help, or the godfather, if you like, of these things. I see Stoicism kind of like a bullet point version of the Socratic dialogues. I think it's hard to know for certain exactly what ancient Stoicism, for instance, was like, because we have less than 1% of the original literature surviving today. So we've got a pretty good idea about typical things that the Stoics believed. But for instance, we don't really know how extensively they used the Socratic method. We can see that Epictetus is really into Socrates, and we can see him using the Socratic method. But I've got a hunch that they used it a little bit more than we would think from Seneca's letters and Marcus Aurelius's meditations, which are not texts that are designed to illustrate that question and answer approach necessarily. In Socrates, we kind of get the arguments and the processes of thinking that lead up to some of the conclusions that we find in Stoicism. And Socrates, I think, anticipates the Stoics in a number of ways. So after writing How to Think a Roman Emperor, I thought about writing a similar kind of book about Socrates. And it's a controversial book because when we first suggested doing How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, my publisher kind of pointed out to me that it was weird to write a book that was that cross-genre. It really is quite unusual. I mean, cross-genre books, interdisciplinary books do exist, but there aren't really many self-help books that involve that much history and philosophy combined with modern psychology. It's an unusual approach. So it was a gamble, and people might have hated it. And some people say it's not to their taste. You know, some people read How to Think a Roman Emperor and were like, why is this self-help book got so much philosophy and so much history in it? I don't get it. Whereas luckily for me, other people were kind of weird like me and enjoyed the stories and the connection between the lives of the individuals. when I studied philosophy at university, I used to always read biographies whenever I could of Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell and the other philosophers that we were studying, because I found that being able to visualize them as three-dimensional, like flesh and blood human beings, made it easier for me to read their philosophy and study it. I could imagine the guy who had written the Tractatus, for example, could picture Wittgenstein and imagine the sound of his voice even. And it made it a little bit more relatable for me. And in the ancient world, Socrates is intertwined with his philosophy to a far greater extent partly because of the dialogue format. But nevertheless, it seemed impossible to me to write a self-help book like How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, but about Socrates, because Socrates is much more complex. His thought isn't expressed in aphorisms, but in these complex dialogues. And he, unfortunately for us, lived through the Peloponnesian War, which lasted 27 years and involved hundreds of Greek cities and was pretty complex. So I thought, how on earth could I cram all of that philosophy and all of that history into one book? And so I thought it would be kind of difficult to do. However, part of my approach to writing is a philosophy or a principle that I call audiobook first. So when I'm writing a book, I imagine first and foremost, not that I'm writing a print book, but that I'm writing a script for an audiobook. And I think if I write a good audiobook, it will also read well. But if I write a good print book, it won't necessarily sound good when it's narrated. So I always imagine I'm writing a script for an audiobook. And the more I focused on it from that perspective, I kind of imagined writing a movie screenplay. Like I said, recently done a graphic novel about Marcus Aurelius. And in that way, I found it easier to imagine how we would tell the story of Socrates in a way that was engaging. And that was part of the reason for doing it, to really pull people in so that they wouldn't find the philosophy, a slog, but it would be tied up with quite dramatic pieces of action and colourful characters, so that it would make it more memorable and more of an experience for them. So we had to do things like abbreviate certain arguments. We had to combine some characters together. We had to fill in some gaps. We had to make decisions about some contradictions in the historical evidence. So it's unlike an academic history where you would evaluate the evidence and explain problems that exist. We have to gloss over it as if we're basically making a movie about Socrates and do our best to remain faithful to the historical evidence, but in a way that results in a kind of dramatized account of his life. So that was how I approached writing it. I think it might be interesting as well to say that my daily routine when I was working on this book would be to go to the library, the National Library of Quebec, and I'd meditate for half an hour every day before I started work. I'd set a little timer and I'd do three things. And the first thing that I would do was a technique called the Benson method that we use in CBT, where I would just count a number each time I exhale in my mind. And then I'd really try to notice the distinction between the voluntary process of repeating the number and the involuntary thoughts that pop into my mind. So it's a very simple meditation technique, but it's very closely related to certain key concepts in modern cognitive therapy. And I would do that first for 10 minutes. And then for 10 minutes, I would visualize that I was talking to Socrates. And he always said similar things. Like if I'd really be racking my brains and questioning him about historical details, like when did this happen and why did that happen? And generally, when I really tried to imagine talking to Socrates, he always thought it was odd that I was so hung up on getting historical details right. He thought surely your priority should be writing a book that's engaging for the readers and gets them interested in the philosophical ideas, that they benefit from, and getting the historical details right isn't, might be impossible in some cases and isn't necessarily that important when it comes to actually helping people to benefit from it. So I was kind of shamed into changing my perspective in a way by imagining that I was talking to Socrates. And only over time, I realized that what I was doing was something that Socrates himself describes doing. Socrates tells us that he engages in imaginary dialogues. If I remember rightly, it's in the Theaetetus he says that when he goes home, he imagines another version of himself and that he's getting these debates with an imaginary Socrates. And there's a number of other instances where he engages in these kind of hypothetical dialogues. So he did something similar. And then the third thing I would do is I'd get a piece of paper or I do it on my computer and I draw two columns and I do a version of the two column technique, which I'm going to talk a little bit about and you'll read about in the book, which seems really weird to me because Socrates explicitly describes this technique that looks like something from modern cognitive psychotherapy. It's something that we would do today. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's in the different sections of the book. I'll say a lot, something, I'd like to say something kind of briefly about each bit in turn. And, and then we'll have some questions and hopefully I'll try to answer them. So the introduction sets the stage. It's like I talk about going to Athens and visiting Academia Platonos Park, where the Plato's Academy was located. And certain ruins are located, some of which may be the ruins of a philosophical school. And going there was, for me, part of the experience of really making Socrates a three-dimensional character, immersing myself in the kind of locations and the history and the archaeological exhibits and the landscape as well. And, climbing the Acropolis and Lycabettus and trying to really imagine what life was like in the time of Socrates was part of my experience. And I tried to, in the audiobook, do that for the reader by using sensory details, talking a lot about smells and colors to really try and evoke the reader's imagination so that it's a little bit more of an immersive experience for them. Because reading philosophical dialogues should be, and I believe that when these dialogues were, the original Platonic dialogues and the dialogues of Xenophon were read to people, they were more vivid for them because they knew the places being described. They weren't just names, when they described going to Piraeus or, talking about going to the academy or the Lyceum, they knew exactly what that looked like and what it smelled like and what it sounded like. And when they talked about Socrates having a debate with Alcibiades or Protagoras or Aspasia, those names meant something to Plato's audience, whereas now they've kind of been lost in the mists of time somewhat. So we read Plato's dialogues now in a more abstract, kind of more impersonal way. I wanted to try and get back to what the earlier experience would have been for the philosophers in the ancient world, where these would have been somewhat more dramatic and evocative experiences for them. And in the introduction, I also talk about how I was really shocked as a psychotherapist when I started reading Xenophon in particular and just seeing stuff that looked like cognitive therapy, like really looked like cognitive therapy 2,400 years before it was supposed to have been invented. And that was one of the things that really inspired me to write books about the relationship between ancient philosophy and modern psychotherapy. Some people think it's a kind of tenuous relationship, but psychotherapy existed in the ancient world. Like, a lot of people think psychotherapy is a modern invention. It's not. Like, they actually had a form of psychotherapy in the ancient world. The Stoics, for example, even have a theory of psychopathology. Like, they wrote books on psychotherapy. So, the Socratic method is a precursor to that. Philosophy and psychotherapy weren't considered to be completely separate things. They were two sides of the same coin. So the first chapter after the introduction, I talk about the trial of Socrates. I mean, choosing where to begin a book is always a kind of tricky subject. And one of the questions I asked myself was, I know that if the beginning of a book isn't engaging enough, then people just read the first couple of chapters of a lot of books and then never get any further. So I think you have to really draw the reader in at the beginning. And I thought, what's the dynamite? What do we have up our sleeve here? I always say that I don't typically recommend books to people. I don't like recommending books to people, but I make one exception. I think every man, woman, and child, and possibly dogs and monkeys, should read Plato's Apology because it's one of the most profound and important texts in the Western philosophical canon, and it's pretty short. and you could read it in a few hours. So I have no hesitation to say that I've always said I think everyone should read the Apology. So from that point of view, I thought, well, I guess I should begin with the Apology. I think this is the kind of ace that we have up our sleeve. So we dive right into what I think is the most powerful part. But then I thought, well, a lot of my readers won't be familiar with the Apology, so then it's awesome. I'm introducing them to something I think is like Shakespeare's Hamlet. It's a masterpiece. So that's what I've always found exciting, a privilege about writing about classics. But I thought a lot of readers are going to have read the Apology. So how can we make it different? So I tried to add as much detail as I could about the courtroom, the jury, the context in which it was taking place. I was quite selective about the aspects of the Apology that I included. And there's a part where we allude to the pronouncement at Delphi, and then I have a little bit of an excuse for a digression, like a cutaway to the scene at Delphi to kind of break things up and make it different. So I hope that we succeeded in telling the story of the Apology in a different way and from a slightly different perspective. And I also combined elements of Xenophon's Apology with Plato's Apology controversially. But yeah, I think that's perfectly fine. Like, I think it's actually a good thing to do. So yeah, that's what I did. And the other thing I wanted to do at the beginning, I thought, where will we start if we're talking about the trial? And I decided to focus on contemplation of death because I wanted to begin with something that we call creative hopelessness in modern psychotherapy. And that's when we get people to begin by kind of clearing the deck of clutter and questioning their existing coping strategies and values. In some ways, it's a bit like the idea of Socratic aporia, the idea people will just kind of came away confused from talking to Socrates. So this kind of creative hopelessness or confusion, can be a good thing if it then liberates us to start questioning things at a deeper level and building up our values again from scratch. So one way of doing that is by contemplating your own mortality in a way that helps you to question the prevailing values of our society and clear the way, as it were, to start reevaluating your own priorities in life. And then the next chapter, which is called The First Philosopher, deals with the story of Anaxagoras. So it's another trial. But I thought it was important to talk about this because although there were many pre-Socratic philosophers, the first philosopher at Athens was Anaxagoras. And it seems to me that Anaxagoras really dominated the cultural scene at Athens. It was primarily the philosophy of Anaxagoras and his followers that I think would have influenced Socrates and shaped his early education. So I think it's important to begin with that. And his trial is very similar to the trial of Socrates, except where kind of generally it's depicted in such a way that he doesn't come out of it looking as good, basically. There's more of a sense that Anaxagoras was somehow diminished by his trial, that he didn't face the injustice of it or face the threat to his own life with the same kind of dignity that Socrates did. And so I thought Socrates must have gone to his own trial with that idea in mind. And in fact, in Plato's Apology, it's Anaxagoras mainly that Socrates says that the jury are confusing him with. So I always felt that Socrates in his trial must have felt that he was redoing what happened to Anaxagoras, but this time he was going to do right by philosophy and exhibit courage and self-discipline and put up a stronger defense of philosophy than Anaxagoras had. So then it makes sense to kind of look at the influence of natural philosophy on Socrates and, what Anaxagoras' trial might have looked like. And that also gives us an excuse to say, well, Socrates differed from Anaxagoras in a number of regards, but one was that he placed much more importance on exploring ethical concepts like the virtues and the goal of life. So that allows us to start really looking at the core questions of what we call value clarification today. The next chapter is called The Female Socrates, and it's mainly about Socrates' mother, Phaenarete, and Aspasia or Aspasia, one of the most enigmatic women in Greek history, in European history, basically. And I was influenced somewhat by Armand Dangour's recent book, Socrates in Love. he's a highly regarded classicist who wrote maybe somewhat controversial book where he speculates that the character of Diotima in Plato's Symposium may be a representation of Aspasia. And we don't know for sure if that's true, but I went along with it because it allows us to say a lot more about Socrates' relationship with Aspasia and to really imagine that much more vividly. So maybe these are two different women. Although he probably, the little bits of evidence that we have about the dates suggest that Socrates probably knew them around the same time. But, either they're the same person or they're two different people who both influenced his early philosophical development. The interesting thing about it is that Diotima teaches Socrates, he says, the art of love. And we're told that Aspasia taught him something similar, the art of matchmaking. And Socrates is really preoccupied with this idea of reconciling friends, helping people to find good friends, and so on. This isn't really a feature of natural philosophy, but it's consistent with the idea that Socrates took earlier philosophy and made it much more concerned with ethical issues in daily life, down to earth issues that really, like friendship, like in matchmaking, like, finding an appropriate spouse, like things that really affect people's quality of life on a day-to-day life. Socrates, we're told, took philosophy down from the heavens and made it apply to our own household. And that's how it was described in the ancient world, the innovation that he made. So I think it's important to talk about that. And then that leads into discussion about another thing that I think is very important in ancient philosophy that's often glossed over, which is the golden rule. The golden rule is what Christians call this idea that we should do unto others as we would have them do unto us. It's famous because some version of it exists in most world religions, most schools of ancient philosophy. And although philosophical ethics is certainly a very complex issue, many thinkers keep coming back to something resembling the golden rule. So I wouldn't say that it's a rigid rule or that it's a complete ethic, but there seems to be some kind of grain of truth to it. And Socrates consistently seems to appeal to a similar concept in the dialogues. And I think it's important because many people feel a bit at sea and lost. The golden rule can help them find a simple ethical principle that can help them at a practical level. There's something similar we do in modern therapy, which is called the double standard strategy. It involves getting people to clarify what the demands are that they impose on other people and whether by shifting perspective back and forth to consider whether they're being hypocritical or contradictory and imposing different demands on themselves or applying different standards to other people than they apply to themselves. And that's a very Socratic approach. Ironing out these contradictions by shifting perspective makes us more consistent, more coherent in our ethical thinking. And it leads, broadly speaking, to something resembling the golden rule. I want to drop in some bits of trivia as I go through. I feel like I've got too much to say here, but I'll try and be brief. I talk about Socrates has a great deal to say about matchmaking and the art of love, and at one point he waxes lyrical about the two Aphrodites, the common or vulgar Aphrodite and the heavenly Aphrodite. And, the art of matchmaking, Aspasia's art, is related to the heavenly Aphrodite, as you'll see. I just wanted to mention that archaeological evidence suggests that a shrine of heavenly Aphrodite, perhaps the main one, was located right beside the Stoa Poikile on the edge of the Agora. So right next to the Stoic school, there's a shrine to the heavenly Aphrodite that Socrates talks about in one of Xenophon's dialogues, in Xenophon's Symposium, if I remember rightly. And supposedly it was also dedicated to the three graces, who I also talk about in this book. So there's a shrine to heavenly Aphrodite and the three graces right beside the ruins still exist today, right beside the Stoa Poikile, which is currently being excavated. The next chapter talks about the Oracle of Apollo. I think I muted myself there for a sec. I think Delphi is one of the most amazing archaeological sites in the world. So that's where we go to for this section. It was the Pythia, the priestess in Delphi, that pronounced the god Apollo speaking through her, that no man is wiser than Socrates. And in Plato's Apology, at least, Socrates says this is really the thing that set him on his philosophical mission. So, I'll cut a long story short, there are many pieces of evidence in classical literature in general that connect the god Apollo with the practice of philosophy. And Socrates repeatedly implies that he sees himself as, in particular, following the instruction of the god Apollo, kind of dedicating his life, in a sense, to the service of Apollo. I think it's interesting because Apollo is also the god of healing, as well as a god associated with reason and the arts. So the therapeutic aspect of philosophy, Apollo would be the god of psychotherapy. I'm not going to say a lot more about this, but the main thing I speculate about here is we don't know that Socrates was with Chaerephon when Chaerephon, one of his best friends, got this pronouncement. But I imagine that he was. I don't think that changes the story that much, but it makes it easier to tell the story. Aristotle tells us that Socrates had been to Delphi. It was difficult to get to Delphi around that time because the route was blockaded and it wasn't easy to get there. And there were only certain times a year that people would make the journey. So, of the limited number of opportunities that Socrates perhaps had to go to Delphi, it seems likely to me that he probably went in the same time as his best friend. I mean, otherwise they were generally, kind of inseparable. So I don't think it's too much of an assumption to say I think Socrates may have been there with Chaerephon. Socrates would have seen the inscription outside the temple of Apollo that says "Know thyself, gnothai auton," which becomes that he returns to a number of times in Plato's dialogues and in Xenophon's dialogues. It becomes a kind of recurring theme in his philosophy. So I allude to that a number of times in this book. In this section, I also talk about the two-column method. I'm not going to say much about this here, except I think it's really cool. And it's one of the most interesting parts from a psychotherapeutic point of view, the method. In a way, the two-column method is like a mechanism for teaching some of the core skills required for the Socratic method. I think, many people could just benefit from practicing a version of the two-column method each day. And there are a number of variations of it. So one would be what Socrates does is to get people to list examples of, like, he creates two columns that are headed justice and injustice, and he gets some examples of injustice, and then asks for exceptions or circumstances where his examples of injustice would be moved over into the other column and might be considered examples of behaving justly. But we can also use the two column technique to weigh up the pros and cons of an idea or a behavior, or to evaluate the difference between good and bad or healthy and unhealthy versions of a behavior. So a number of different ways that we can use it. What it teaches us to do is identify exceptions in our thinking, exceptions to general rules, definitions, and principles. And that encourages cognitive flexibility, which I think is psychologically very important. The next chapter is called The Wisest Man Alive, which is what Protagoras was called by his followers. So I'm just going to throw in some bits of trivia that might be interesting. I did an interview a while back with Armand Dangour, and I mentioned this cryptic reference in Plato's Apology where Socrates says after getting this pronouncement, he went and spoke to an unnamed famous politician, and he alienated this guy and upset a number of his followers. We don't know who this was, but it would be really interesting and if we were trying to tell Socrates' story, if we knew who this unnamed politician was. Now, as soon as I said that, Armand Dangour said, well, of course, it's Pericles. Who else could it be? And it may have been Pericles, but I think it could also have been Protagoras. Now, you may say, well, hang on a minute. Protagoras was called the wisest man alive. He was the first person to call himself a sophist, which basically means a wise man. So if you're looking for someone wise, it would make sense to go to him first if you're in Socrates' position. But Protagoras was a sophist, not a politician. But Protagoras was a politician. He was actually sent as an envoy by the Athenians to oversee the drafting of laws for their colony in the south of Italy called Thurii. So Protagoras was actually a politician of sorts. It's possible that that's who Socrates is talking about, but we don't know for sure. It may be Pericles. I chose to imply that it was Protagoras, though. I think it makes the story, there's one way of telling the story that perhaps makes it a little bit more coherent, a little bit more interesting. In the Protagoras, I feel that Socrates can be seen basically inventing a form of cognitive behavioral therapy that we call problem solving training, or PST, today. Most problems that people exhibit in psychotherapy have to do with the fact that they'll sacrifice their long term welfare to avoid short term discomfort or to obtain short term pleasure. So, focusing too much on the short term. And it has to do with the fact that short term pain and pleasure are more salient. They're more vivid than the idea of distant pain and pleasure. So we often do things that are against our interests in the long term because it's less painful or more pleasant in the short term. That's the basic structure of many problems that people exhibit in psychotherapy. And Socrates is really talking about this issue and in this dialogue and teasing it apart. This is the foundation, the conceptual foundation of a particular type of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's remarkable to see him basically inventing the underlying concept. And I think the first step to overcoming this problem is to really grasp the fact that we're biased in this way. So Socrates is taking a kind of first step therapeutically here as well. The next chapter is called The Lion of Athens. And it's about Alcibiades or Alcibiades, the Athenian statesman who was a friend or possibly a lover of Socrates. And it focuses on a dialogue that's attributed to Plato, although there's some disagreement about whether it's authentically Plato or maybe one of his students that wrote it. It discusses the idea of wisdom as self-knowledge, the first Alcibiades, and it uses this powerful image of the eye of wisdom or self-knowledge as being the eye that sees itself, which I found very interesting. I think Socrates' meaning in this dialogue is kind of obscure, but it really resonates with me as a therapist because he seems to be saying that the best mirror available for the human soul is another human being, and that by questioning other people in a very honest and penetrating way, we are potentially able to gain more insight into our own biases, because we see other people and we think, maybe I'm making the same mistakes as them. We can evaluate other people more objectively. We can see them more clearly than we see ourselves because we're biased. We have blind spots when it comes to our own self. The eye doesn't normally see itself except in a mirror. And so by questioning other people in these dialogues, which he did all day, I think Socrates saw himself as developing self-knowledge by using them as a kind of mirror for his soul. It's a very interesting concept. I link that to the idea of Iliism, which I know is one of the most popular ideas in this book. Immediately, it's one of the things that people start asking me about. I also interviewed Professor Igor Grossman recently, who has conducted research on Iliism at the University of Waterloo, where he runs a centre for research on the nature of wisdom. And Iliism is when you refer to yourself in the third person. So adopting a more objective perspective on yourself, shifting perspective. So you're viewing yourself as if you were looking at another person. Again, it's similar to what I think is going on in the Socratic dialogues. But one method of replicating this is just to keep a journal where you refer to yourself using your name and third person pronouns like he or she, him or her, so that you start to evaluate yourself with greater objectivity. And there's research evidence to show that leads to an increase of about 15 to 30% in different measures of wise reasoning, incidentally. Then there's a chapter in the book about the Peloponnesian War. Now, the Peloponnesian War lasted 27 years. It's pretty complicated. So as we go through the book, we talk really about different phases in it. And Socrates was a hoplite. He fought in at least 3 major battles of the Peloponnesian War. So it's an important part of his life, and I didn't think we could leave that out. And I think it adds to some of the drama and some of the excitement of his story. Then we go on and talk about the Sicilian expedition, which is associated with Alcibiades, although he had to abandon the expedition. And it was Athens' greatest military defeat. It's actually hard to articulate how much of a disaster the Sicilian expedition was. In ancient battles, not always, but in many cases, there might not be as many casualties as you would think because the defeated side would retreat, sometimes before losing too many men. But in the Sicilian expedition, the Athenians reputedly lost 40,000 men altogether and something like 100 or 200 ships. I mean, it was absolutely catastrophic for them. So this had a huge impact on the status. It was really the beginning of the end of what scholars refer to as the Athenian Empire. As we're talking about the war, I talk about Plato's dialogue, the Gorgias or Gorgias, which is all about rhetoric and the idea that rhetoricians or politicians are kind of like self-improvement confectioners. Like they tell people what they want to hear, and their only interest is in the amount of applause that they can get, the amount of status that they can get. So it leads to a way of interacting with people, the way of the sophist or the rhetorician, which doesn't care about truth. Like it only cares about persuading other people to agree with you, winning arguments, and earning acclaim. So politicians who trained with sophists wouldn't think it's necessary, as Gorgias brags about the fact that his students don't have to study medicine or shipbuilding or military strategy in order to win debates about these subjects in the assembly. He thinks this is a selling point, whereas Socrates thinks this should be shocking, you know? So somebody who's trained in rhetoric would every time defeat a medical expert in the assembly when it comes to debates about what's in the interests of public health, for example. And Socrates is extremely concerned about this. It's obviously, I think when people read some of these things, they see parallels with modern society as well. Then the chapter following that is about the fall of Athens. The dialogue that I talk about here is one of my favorite. This is one of the reasons that there are some things in this book that people who are interested in Plato and maybe studied him at university might find familiar, like the Apology, some old classics, old standards. But there's also stuff in here that I think people might be surprised by. And then at first they might not think it's historically derived. But if they look in the footnotes, there are 200 or 300 footnotes, and they'll see the sources referenced. For example, the dialogue in this chapter about the fall of Athens is from a pseudo-Platonic dialogue called the Axiochus, and it's probably like one of my favorite Platonic dialogues, although it's generally believed that Plato himself didn't write it. But it may have been written by one of the next generation of Platonists, one of Plato's students, possibly. We don't really know who the author is. In that dialogue, originally, it's Alcibiades' friend and uncle, Axiochus, who's having the conversation with Socrates. So I sometimes I'll compress characters together for the sake of the narrative. So what I did here was imagine that this is the sort of conversation that Socrates may have also had with Alcibiades, who's a more familiar character to the reader. But it doesn't change the content of the argument that Socrates presents in any way. And it's, it may have been, Alcibiades may even have been present when Socrates is having this discussion with his friend. I may have heard about it, perhaps. So I think it's about coming to terms with our own mortality. It's an odd bird because it's an example of what philosophers call consolation literature. But consolation literature is normally letters that are written to another person to console them when they're bereaved or coming to terms with their own death. Axiochus, it's a dialogue. Sorry, consolation letters are usually consoling people of bereavement, whereas in Axiochus, he's coming to terms with his own death, and it's in the form of a dialogue, which makes it a little bit different. So it's very interesting. Another odd thing about it is some of the arguments in it are attributed to Prodicus, who is a student of Protagoras, who's one of the leading sophists. And there are arguments that are normally attributed to Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, but this dialogue claims that they go much back much further, which is plausible. Then the second last chapter is about the 30 tyrants. So I don't want to be too heavy-handed about this. And actually, I don't have a strong opinion about it. But I think anyone reading the book will naturally start to wonder whether some of the flaws in Athenian democracy are similar to some of the weaknesses that we see in modern democracy. And the concerns that we have about dictatorships in the modern world are prefigured by the collapse of Athenian democracy into the dictatorship of the 30 tyrants, for example. So Socrates lived through this dictatorship, which was relatively brief, but quite brutal. And in this chapter, I talk about one of his most radical ideas, the idea mentioned in the Apology as well, that the perpetrator of injustice harms himself, but doesn't harm his victim, which is a radical idea. That often the most interesting ideas that we get from Socrates are ideas that you won't necessarily agree with, but they'll get you thinking and you'll remember them years or even decades later. Socrates is really good at asking questions or posing ideas that really stick in your mind and cause you to question things quite radically and keep thinking them over. He's good at introducing radically different perspectives. I do relate this to an interesting finding in modern psychology, though, which is that perceived injustice appears to be closely related to the psychology of anger. It's integral to it, but also seems to lead to clinical depression. So something about our conceptualization of justice, you could say our philosophy of justice, may make us vulnerable to depression, such as whether we see injustice in the world as something that we disagree with, but that we don't feel depressed about or overwhelmed by, or whether we get kind of neurotic about it and depressed about it. What's the difference between objecting to injustice and becoming depressed about injustice? This, I think, is one of the thorniest questions in modern psychology. We don't want people to be apathetic to the injustices in the world, but we don't want them to be neurotic about them either and constantly just outraged in an unproductive way. You know, I think Socrates, in part, and the Stoics are questioning how we feel about the injustice in and whether we see it as kind of somehow degrading or harming us, or whether we're able to view it in a more objective, more detached way, still nevertheless objecting against it, maybe taking action to prevent it. The final chapter is called the Swan Song. It actually refers to a metaphor that Plato uses in the Phaedo. So I wasn't sure. In the last chapter, I wanted to talk about the death of Socrates. I couldn't see any other way to end the book except by talking about the execution of Socrates. It's the other very dramatic moment in his life. But again, it's kind of a familiar moment. So I wanted to tell it from a different perspective. And I chose to tell it from the perspective of Phaedo, who's one of Socrates' youngest students. We don't know a lot about him, but he's a very intriguing character because, as you'll see, Phaedo was a young man who was captured, probably by the Athenians or their allies, during the Peloponnesian War, enslaved, and he was very handsome. So Socrates is very intrigued by the idea that what seems like good fortune can turn out to be bad fortune, and vice versa. Phaedo was a very good-looking young guy, which seems like good fortune, except when he was captured, that meant he was enslaved and sold to a brothel. So he was sex trafficked, basically. So it turned out, in a sense, to be unfortunate for him. He was exploited by his captors because of his good looks. And the story goes that Phaedo learned about Socrates and pleaded with him to help him. And Socrates got his wealthy friends to buy Phaedo and set him free. And he went on to become one of his most devoted students. And he wrote Socratic dialogues and founded a school of philosophy, although none of the dialogues that he wrote survive today. But he's remembered because Plato named one of his dialogues, the Phaedo, after him, and he features prominently in it. So in this, I combine elements of Plato's Phaedo and also Xenophon's account of Socrates' death and some other bits and pieces. So we're telling a slightly different version, adding some archaeological details or historical details to make the scene more vivid. And I really hope it's evocative for people because I know that in the ancient world, it was the way that Socrates faced his death that people remembered first and foremost. Despite all the important and radical things he said and the philosophical method that he introduced, the thing that had the most profound effect on ancient philosophers was just the image of Socrates' noble death. And so I wanted to end the book on that, but present it in a way that was quite melodramatic, quite emotive. And especially when people listen to the audiobook, I wanted to kind of get them in the feels, because then I felt that they would feel a stronger connection with the story of Socrates' life. And that's what would make them more engaged with some of the philosophical arguments that we find in those dialogues. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's not too bad in terms of timing. I hope that you found that quick synopsis of the contents of this book interesting. Maybe it kind of makes you a little bit more interested, gives you some ideas to think about as you're reading it or listening to it. So without further ado, I'll hand back over to Phil and open the floor to you, the audience, and see if you have any questions that I can attempt to answer. I don't always know the answer, but that hasn't stopped me before.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This is fantastic. Let me just give instructions to the audience. If you have questions, type them inside the chat. Let's try that first and see how we go with that. But if you got questions about something that Donald said, or you got questions about the book, stick that inside the chat. Let me ask you something here first, and as these pop in. You started us off, and by the way, you mentioned it. I'm glad you did. The end notes are fantastic. I mean, so, most people might read a book and then stop, but I think there is a ton of information inside the end notes of the book. So I'm glad that you mentioned that in here because I think they're well worth reading as well.
That's probably, yeah. That's probably so
ahead.
People don't just say that I'm making it all up. So I tended to explain why I'd make certain decisions, or sometimes when I've said something that's controversial in the footnotes or the end notes, I'll kind of say, this is, there's some evidence to support this, even though it's not what people normally say.
Yeah. Well, yes, that makes complete sense to me because I think you're absolutely right. People are going to ask the question, well, where did that come from? Or how did you come by this idea? And, there's tons of notes in here and that kind of lets us know that you did your homework and you weren't, as they say, you weren't just making stuff up.
It was about 150.
You told us what you made up.
Told you what. Yeah.
How did you start with you said I had this sort of sequence of 3 exercises that I did as I got ready. How did you come to those as a good way to start? Why did you think that was what you wanted to do?
I don't know. I mean, I'm very lucky because I'm a techniques guy and I trained psychotherapists, life coaches, counselors for many years. And, I had a very structured approach to skills training with them. So I know and have a lot of experience in lots of different meditation techniques, visualization techniques, all sorts of psychological techniques. So I guess from that, I just picked some that I found useful and that I enjoyed doing, and I made them part of my daily routine. These were the ones that seemed to help me the most when I was writing. And I think some sort of mindfulness type meditation technique is a good way of kind of changing state and getting yourself into a more reflective frame of mind for writing. So that's why I did the Benson method first. I like the simplicity of the Benson method as well. Often, like most things in life, the more you study a subject, the more you start to think it's actually the kind of simplest concepts and ideas that you keep coming back to in a way, like they seem kind of foundational. And then just, again, the second technique's pretty simple as well, just visualizing that I'm talking to Socrates. I was dealing with such a lot of complex material that I needed, the only way to make sense out of it was to look at it from an altered perspective. And the easiest way that I know of doing that would just be to ask another guy. And who better to ask than Socrates? So I'd say, hey, Socrates, I'm writing this book about you. And, I don't really get why you said this or that, or why was this thing so important to you? And a lot of the time he wouldn't even give me a straight answer, but just thinking about it and trying to imagine what he might say helped me view what I was doing with greater objectivity, I think. And that helped me to kind of simplify the mess of information that I was dealing with. It helped give me a bit of focus. And then using the 2-column technique is useful because say, for example, I present an argument or I describe a technique, I try and anticipate criticisms, if you like. So I'll go, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this concept? What's the evidence for and against it? So I don't
Right.
fall into the trap of just stating it as if it's obviously true. I'm kind of thinking, I think this is a good idea, but there are one or two obvious weaknesses with it. And then maybe I can kind of try and address those or anticipate them, or like do more research on their implications, for example. So that's why I use those three techniques. And I timed each one I would spend only 10 minutes on. So the whole thing only took me half an hour every day when I was writing.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that stood out to me is that having that conversation with Socrates allowed you to leave the bubble of your life and go into the bubble of writing and center it around Socrates. So you forgot about your grocery list and kids and all the rest for a moment, and you could go into that bubble. And so I think it's a really valuable technique. I didn't realize you were doing that. Okay, let's go with this easy question first, and then we're going to go into some of the ones that are a little bit longer.
They're my
What is
favorite types of question.
the easy ones?
Yeah.
I knew that.
To be honest, I quite like the difficult ones as well, I'll be honest. I do quite like the difficult ones.
What's we saw one of the tattoos on your arm. I forget which one we saw. What does that say?
This is Uden de non peponthas in ancient
Nothing
Greek.
terrible.
I don't know
Yeah,
if you
has
see that.
happened to you, right?
It says nothing terrible has happened to you. It's a quote from Crates of Thebes, who said it to Zeno. So I always wonder, Zeno wrote a book, the founder of Stoicism wrote a book that was his recollections of Crates. And we were told this anecdote about him. I wonder if that was from his book about his recollections of Crates. But I think this quote is important because to me it encapsulates something that's quite fundamental about Stoicism. In Stoicism, there's a distinction between the events that befall us and then the value judgments that we impose on them. So literally nothing terrible could happen to you because terribleness is a value judgment that we impose on the things that happen to
Right.
us. Terribleness doesn't exist in nature. Like it's a value judgment. Like,
That's right.
so like that would be like, saying that nothing intrinsic, nothing humorous could happen. Things that can happen to you and you could find them humorous. Like
Right.
things can happen to you and you find them tragic, but it's reminding you that these value judgments originate from within you. You're doing them. Like nothing catastrophic ever happens to you, we might say in CBT, but you're the one who catastrophizes events. It's an activity. One of the basic psychological errors that we fall into is we treat those value judgments as if they're physical properties, like think something is big or small, or it's black or white, it's terrible, it's humorous, like, it's offensive. Like, but those aren't
Yeah.
physical properties of external events. Those are value judgment responses that we choose to have to them.
Yeah. I love I think this particularly comes out in RABT, but these are all fictions. Those judgments are all fictions that we've created for ourselves.
Yeah.
We've turned the knob up on the awfulizing of this to a 10 or 11 or something like that. But we did it all inside of our head because otherwise it was just oh my goodness, you dropped a cup and it broke. Was that terrible?
It's a story that we tell ourselves, a narrative that we
Right.
construct.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question, and I'm going to read it as it is written first. I have a question about cognitive flexibility in the
Yeah.
context of varying moral compasses. Given that people often navigate different value systems, how can we reconcile this with the principles of Stoicism, especially considering the Stoic emphasis on core values? Specifically, how can we maintain adherence to Stoic values when cognitive flexibility might lead to bending or adjusting these core values based on different circumstances
Yeah.
or perspectives? Maybe I just leave it there. You answer
Well,
that.
I don't think cognitive flexibility. So cognitive flexibility is basically our ability to look at events from a variety of different points of view, right? So say you don't send me a Christmas card this year, Phil, right? I might think, if I'm really depressed, I might think, well, Phil hates me. right?
Yeah,
And
right.
that might be the only way that I have of interpreting it. But if I'm a pretty robust individual and I don't get depressed easily, I might think, well, it's possible Phil hates me, or it might just be that he forgot, or it might just be that he doesn't think sending Christmas cards is a particularly important thing to do, or it might be because I didn't send him one, he doesn't think I'm expecting one in return, or maybe he sent one that got lost in the post, like whatever. There's a
Send
number
it
of
to your old
possible,
address.
yeah,
Yeah,
but there's a number of possible interpretations. Which one is true? I don't know, right? Maybe some seem more plausible than others, but I'm capable of imagining multiple perspectives. And that ability to see a number of different perspectives tends to mitigate against strong emotional responses. And it also tends to be conducive to problem solving. Like, so if I'm thinking, well, how am I going to respond? If I think, well, Phil hates me and I've got tunnel vision, then I'm very limited in terms of the number of possible responses that I could imagine, right? Well, maybe I should just be rude to him next time I see him or something like that. That's the only thing that makes sense if I assume that Phil hates me, right? But if I think,
right.
well, I don't know, it might be that he hates me, or it might be he's just forgotten, or it might be something else, then it's easier for me to imagine a range of options. I I have to be tolerant of a certain amount of uncertainty to be able to shift freely between these different perspectives. But it doesn't mean that they're all equally valid, right? So it
Right.
could also be that I imagine some people might have a completely different perspective in a situation, and I might think they're probably wrong, right? Someone else might look at this situation and think this Phil did this on purpose because he's trolling me, and he's got this kind of weird sense of humor. That might be someone else. That may be what my wife thinks is going on. But I might think that
Yeah,
seems really unlikely to me, right? But I can imagine, nevertheless, I can imagine that being how someone else might look at it, right? So to cognitive empathy and understanding other points of view requires cognitive flexibility, but it doesn't mean that I agree with all of the perspectives. It just means that I'm not rigidly tied into experiencing the world through one of them. So the Stoics, for example, would say that wisdom is a virtue, but that's different from saying, for instance, that, I can't imagine somebody ever disagreeing with that, right?
yeah,
So I might say, I believe that, but I can anticipate criticisms of it. Like I can imagine there's some people that don't get that or who interpret the concept of wisdom differently from me. I'll give you an example. In the meditations, funnily enough, here's a controversial example. And how nuanced a concept this is illustrated by the fact that people get annoyed with me for saying this, right? In the meditations, Marcus Aurelius says 9 times that whether the universe is ordered by providence or whether it's just a random collision of atoms, either way, various aspects of Stoic ethics are still valid, right? And yet Marcus Aurelius clearly seems to believe in providence, right? So he both believes strongly in providence, but is capable of imagining that he might be wrong and that the universe might be governed by the collision of atoms. He doesn't believe that, like, but he considers it as a plausible alternative point of view, right? Just because he doesn't
right.
agree with something, it doesn't make it inconceivable to him. He's open-minded, curious, and flexible enough to be able to, and repeatedly imagines, yeah, but what if I'm wrong? What if the universe isn't governed by providence? I still think it would be important to exhibit generosity towards other human beings and pursue wisdom and stuff like that anyway, for example.
Right.
I think this is missing from modern society and in particular, maybe particularly modern American political debate on social media. I think everyone can see, that Republicans and Democrats just think each other are crazy. And you'll see this all the time. People going, I can't understand why anyone would have voted for Donald Trump. It's just inconceivable to me. It's just why on earth or why would anybody vote for Kamala Harris? Like it's just completely inconceivable to me, right? Whereas I can remember it. I feel like in the past, more people were capable of saying, well, I didn't vote for Donald Trump and I wouldn't vote for him. Maybe I wouldn't vote for him in a month of Sundays. but I kind of get why some people did vote for him. It doesn't seem
Right.
totally inconceivable to me, right? So that's a form of cognitive flexibility. It's the ability to empathize, right? It's the ability to
Yeah.
understand somebody's position who disagrees with you. So
Right.
that I
And
don't,
that's what you're getting at is that
yeah,
we understand it, but that doesn't mean that we agree with it and that
yeah,
we
we don't
don't.
have to agree with it.
And we could look at this and say, I understand exactly how you got to where you are. I don't agree with it. And by the way, I'm going to do what I can to minimize your impact on society
Yeah.
because that's what I think is the right thing to do. Yeah.
So cognitive diffusion or distancing is closely related to cognitive flexibility. It's not the same, but they're
Right.
kind of connected ideas. And people have the same question about cognitive diffusion. At first they tend to think, like, if I believe, say, I believe that people should respect me, right? And that makes me really angry when they don't. This is a really common thing that clients say in therapy, right? But it's true. People should respect me, right? So if I practice cognitive diffusion on that, and basically I could take a step back and observe myself holding that belief and the consequences of holding it, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm rejecting the belief or that I think it's wrong. I could still have or that I'm kind of ignoring it, or I can still have a conversation. I can imagine it written in big letters up on the wall and view that statement in a detached way, and we can have a conversation about whether it's true or false and what the pros and cons are of believing it. We can carry on thinking about it. The only difference is I'm doing it from a more detached perspective. I might still conclude that it's basically true, but perhaps I was interpreting it in a kind of somewhat rigid way. Yeah, maybe sometimes I need to have a little bit more flexibility about how I define what showing respect means, or like what constitutes a significant breach of that rule and stuff like that. There's a little bit of
Right.
nuance in how I interpret it, perhaps. But cognitive diffusion doesn't mean necessarily rejecting the belief. It just means
Right.
experiencing it from a different perspective that allows me to, see its implications and, understand possible consequences to it more clearly, you know. So it's
Yeah.
tricky because we normally just think in terms of agreeing or disagreeing with beliefs, but there are other ways of experiencing beliefs in terms of our fusion or diffusion from them, whether we have tunnel vision for them or whether we're able to also understand alternative perspectives. And those are not directly related to whether the belief is true or false.
Right. All right. Let's get to this question from Dimitri. He says, I think that's a he, about the Sicilian expedition. Sounds like a
Yeah.
history question. About the Sicilian expedition, why did the Athenians keep on throwing assets beyond
Yeah.
sensible and towards their own destruction? Is
Right.
Socrates affected by this?
Now I should have said this at the beginning, right? That I should have covered myself by saying I don't claim to be an expert on ancient history or an expert on the Greek language or even an expert on philosophy, although I have a philosophy degree and I've written a number of books about ancient history. So I'm not a total novice. But actually, I think of myself as writing these books more from the perspective of a psychotherapist, funnily enough, although there's a lot of history
Hmm.
and philosophy in
Right.
them. And the reason that I write them is because I don't think classicists and philosophers have often, I think they often overlook some of the psychological insights that we find. When I read Xenophon and Plato, there's things that really jump out at me. And then I go and read commentaries by academic philosophers and I think, why has nobody mentioned like these obvious like things that why does nobody mention that Xenophon is basically clearly doing cognitive therapy and relationships therapy, like Socrates is doing in Xenophon's Memorabilia? Nevertheless, I'll have a go at responding to historical questions. Why did the Athenians keep throwing assets at the Sicilian expedition? It's a tricky. Military questions are usually multifactorial, right? Like, what caused the First World War and stuff like that. Like, I don't know, a bunch of
Right.
factors combined, really. There's probably not a single cause. I think one thing is that Nicaeus was frightened to admit defeat because he, like, naturally was afraid that he was going to be put on trial for treason and maybe executed if he went back to Athens and declared such a huge expedition a failure. So I think he was scared. They committed so much to it in the first place that it was, it was difficult for them to back out of it. Basically, I think is one of
Right.
the problems. Like, and so he may have been overly optimistic. So we're told that he insisted that he had partisans within the city of Syracuse who were working on throwing open the gates and undermining the regime and stuff. And apparently that was all BS and it never transpired, right? But that kind of maybe was his excuse so that he didn't have to admit defeat and go back to Athens and get put on trial and executed, possibly. That might be maybe one possible reason. I guess another explanation is that the Athenians lost a lot of money and resources, and they probably thought it's like a sunk cost. And maybe it's an example of what we call sunk cost reasoning, right?
Cost fallacy. Yeah.
Like we've put so much into this, we can't come away empty-handed. Like we have to conquer Syracuse. Syracusans have got loads of money. There's loads of
Right.
timber, like horses, other resources here. We can't come away from it. It's all or nothing. If we quit, like we've just lost a fortune, like, and we've lost status. We've kind of humiliated ourselves. I guess that's the other thing. That's a separate point. But first of all, we've committed a lot of resources. We've lost a lot of money. Like we need to get money and resources by doing this to kind of make up for that, and maybe slaves. And then the other thing would be the
Yeah.
loss of status. So a big problem, I get now we're into like 3, 4 different causes, right? So another thing would be the Athenian Empire was held together with the glue of maybe, various allies of Athens trusting the Athenians or being scared of them, one or the other. And I think the Athenians would have been scared that if they lost, that some of their allies would have broken away from them and lost faith in them, or others, might no longer fear for them and may have rebelled against them. So they might worry it would trigger a kind of domino effect of uprisings against their authority, like if they
Right.
saw them being defeated in Sicily. That might be, and then
Okay.
there's other things. There's a couple of other things as well. Once the Spartans got involved, never getting into the nitty gritty of it. Like, I think the Athenians thought, oh, we've blown this now because the Syracusans are going to get involved in the Peloponnesian War as allies of the Spartans. So we need to stop that from happening because it's going to empower our
Right.
enemy. Like, so I think there's a bunch of reasons why that happened. Then there's many other puzzling things about it. Why did they say, one thing I'll say about this, right? And I could be wrong about this as well. Like, I'm not a historian, but it strikes me that one of the reasons that we're told the version of this story that we're told, Alcibiades reputedly went to the assembly and said, give me 20 ships. I'll lead them myself. Like, I'll handpick like allies that I'm going to take with me. We'll send a crack team. Like, we'll build alliances, win people over to the Athenian side, mobilize the cities that are neutral or allied to us in the region, like, and we'll wage war against Syracuse, and that's how we're going to do it. Kind of almost like a proxy war to some extent, right? We're going to get local cities to fight on our side. He'd done something similar before, and the Athenians didn't let him do that. They put him on trial, and so he fled and went over to the Spartan side, or he sought refuge in Sparta. But when the Spartans eventually sent a general, I can't help but notice that he did something not unlike what Alcibiades had originally suggested. So the Spartans the other thing I notice about it's kind of ironic about the Sicilian expedition is that the Spartans kind of stole the original Athenian strategy. Like, that was Alcibiades' I mean, it may be that Alcibiades advised the Spartans to do that, but they sent a small elite force and trained the Syracusans, right? And that worked out better for them, whereas the Athenians sent a load of their own troops and it ended up in a disaster. So I think it could maybe part of what's going on in that story is if the Athenians had listened to Alcibiades and followed his strategy, they might actually have been more successful.
Wow. That's Monday morning quarterback.
But we'll never know.
So we will never know. Okay.
Go
From
back in
Dan.
time and change it. Well, I would have a redo of the Sicilian expedition.
Yeah, just wind it back and press play again. Try something different. From Dan, would a Socratic oriented therapy differ substantially from a Stoic focused one? If so,
You
in
know?
what major ways, he says, but are they not descendants of each other?
That's a really tricky question to answer. I mean, I guess it depends. Different people might interpret the philosophy of Socrates differently. For example, it depends we how much we trust Plato's dialogues, or how much Plato's dialogues we exclude as being coming from Plato and be like. So it's generally accepted that the theory of forms, which is Plato's famous metaphysic, is not something that Socrates ever said, and that Plato is using
Right.
Socrates as a mouthpiece for this. And we have in our corner some support from Aristotle, who says at one point that Plato was the first person to introduce the concept of the forms. And if
Right.
that's true, then Socrates could not have gone about saying the stuff that Plato has him saying, like in most of his dialogues, like in the middle and later dialogues. So it might be that, some people attribute some of those metaphysical concepts to Socrates, whereas others, like, for example, in the other bit of evidence we have is that in Xenophon's memorabilia, Socrates has got like virtually no interest in metaphysics. And we're also told
Right.
that Socrates had no interest in metaphysics by other authors.
But Plato
So
did.
yeah, but Plato did, because his he was influenced by Pythagoreanism, and arguably that's where the metaphysics is coming from. Like I said, Xenophon's account of Socrates is more like cognitive therapy, because it's more it's more down to earth. He's not interested in trying to grasp the underlying concept in this kind of abstract metaphysical way that Plato gets into. So, how similar would it be to Stoic therapy? There would be more tech. I mean, this is a superficial kind of answer, but the Stoic therapy would have a wider range of techniques, because Stoicism evolved over 5 centuries.
Right.
And so by the time we get down to Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, like Marcus Aurelius, for instance, I use this example a lot, but Marcus Aurelius lists 10 different techniques for managing anger. Well, you wouldn't find that breadth of different techniques, for example, in Socrates. So you could argue that the basic concept is there in Socrates,
Right.
that he hasn't had time to develop the same repertoire of techniques and concepts that the Stoics have got.
Well,
So
it's 5 centuries of
yeah,
additional work on the
that would
same
be different.
ideas. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, and I mean, again, like I said earlier, it's not clear how much emphasis the Stoics placed on Socratic questioning as a method. And actually, controversially, it seems to me that the Stoics differed quite a lot from one another, and that probably some of them
sure.
made quite extensive use of Socratic questioning, and others were kind of more dogmatic in the way that they presented their thinking. So, for example, Epictetus seems to use Socratic questioning in the discourses, although he only does that a handful of times. But we don't really see Seneca or Marcus Aurelius doing that. So it may
Yeah.
be that other Stoics like use a questioning method that was much more like Socrates. So again, there's a lot of unknowns, and they're kind of trivial unknowns in a way. We just don't really know. The basic
Yeah.
ideas are similar, but we don't know if they would have had the same kind of emphasis. Like we would probably use a lot of questioning techniques today in therapy, perhaps. But I mean, I think there's reason to believe that when Stoics were training, they probably did use more of the Socratic method. We just don't see that. We have less than 1% of the Stoic
Sure.
literature. I mean, when Marcus Aurelius was studying Stoicism with Junius Rusticus, I don't imagine that Rusticus just sat down and rattled off a bunch of aphorisms to him. I think he probably interrogated him about his values and pointed out
Right.
contradictions in his behavior and stuff like that in a way that was more akin to what we see Socrates doing, and particularly in Xenophon's memorabilia.
We certainly see Epictetus barking questions at his students in the discourses, right? I mean, he is clearly looking, what do you think? How did you come by that? So it does it's not dialectic, but he's clearly causing them to query their thinking in that
And
space.
he's explicitly pointing out contradictions between their
Right.
thinking and their behavior, or between different opinions that they hold, in a way that's similar to Socrates. So I don't know, did he do that a lot? If that was like how he was doing therapy, like when he was kind of working or developing the character of his students, then yeah, it would look a lot like what Socrates was doing. But that's maybe partly because Epictetus is deliberately modeling it on Socrates. I'm not
Right.
sure that all Stoics would have done things in that way. I mean, again, little, we have references to other Stoics that make it look like what they're doing is very different, but I digress. My main point is
Yeah.
that we know very little about what the Stoics actually did, and there's reason to believe that there was a certain amount of diversity between their approaches, but potentially Stoic therapy would be very similar to, like, if it resembles what Epictetus is doing in certain parts of the discourses, then it would be very similar, I think, to what Socrates is doing in the Memorabilia.
Right. All right. Joe Bullock asks, you mentioned how the ancients practiced psychology. However, there's a distinction between merely coping with the world and truly thriving, finding meaning in life. This raises the question, is genuine mental well-being rooted in virtue rather than psychological techniques? Also, could ethics or virtue offer a framework or reasoning to address anger? Do you think reflecting on what is just, our
Mm.
reactions might become more measured and proportionate, thus reducing anger?
But I don't see the same dichotomy. Like, so reflecting on values is, in a sense, an obviously philosophical approach, but it's something that we do all the time in psychotherapy. I don't see there being a sharp divide there between psychology and philosophy. I mean, just to really drive that point home, modern state of the art, I say this all the time, but like I use this example a lot. Behavioral activation, which is one of the leading evidence-based treatments for clinical depression, really heavily focuses on this idea of clarifying people's virtues or values, because it's seen as one of the main factors that contributes to mental health, and particularly the treatment of depression. So, I mean, if you looked at that approach, and there are other approaches that are kind of similar to it, is obviously like similar to the Socratic method as a being used as a means of clarifying the virtues. What was the other part of the question? What was the last part of the question again?
Do you think reflecting on what is just, our
Oh,
reactions might
yeah.
become more measured and proportionate? Essentially, reducing our own anger about a thing. It changes our judgment, right?
Now, I'm going to give a strange answer to that question, which is I think there's 101 ways to reduce anger. So, yeah, like, I mean, my view about emotions like anger and anxiety is that they're far more fragile than people typically assume. And
Hmm.
it's like, the real problem, the underlying problem is that our folk psychology, like the default psychology that we all have as a society, is pretty rubbish and primitive and crude. And so people typically buy into what psychologists sometimes call the hydraulic model of emotion. So a lot of people will think that anger is just like this force or feeling that kind of wells up within you, like an energy or pressure, and you can discharge it in activities like punching bags at the gym or lifting weights, or you can kind of try and suppress it, or you can kind of vent it or whatever. But they think of energy, like they think of anger and anxiety as just kind of homogenous in a way and featureless. But in fact, they're more like a recipe that's made up of lots of different ingredients, and or like a piece of like a watch with lots of different cogs in it, right? So anger is multi-component. It's a cake that's baked from many ingredients. Like it's got eggs and flour and sugar and water in it and stuff. And if you take one of those ingredients out, then you won't end up with a cake anymore. Like you just end up with something different, right? So there are lots of ways that you could change the recipe. So would focusing on the idea of, yeah, like, I mean, the 101 things, doing almost anything except following the recipe. ironically, like the weird thing is
Hmm.
when people get angry, they typically follow a fairly rigid pattern, right? And almost any deviation from it will tend to disrupt like the escalation of anger. I mean, that's the weird thing. Like people think anger and worry are difficult to control, but they're completely wrong in a sense, like because doing almost anything potentially derails. I mean, if you told someone every time they get angry to rub their tummy and pat their head, or and part of the reason that I'm saying this is that when we do research on coping strategies, like we typically find that you can get people to do any number of random things and it will potentially disrupt the functioning of certain emotions. I mean,
Right.
like literally,
Stops the dialogue, right?
yeah,
Their
like
internal dialogue on the problem. They just think it causes them to stop ruminating over it, and then they find out they're not angry anymore.
yeah, it's it's far more delicate than people realize. Like, it doesn't seem like anger's such a delicate flower, but it is. And like, for example, just introducing like any number of things, like introducing pause of like 5 seconds at the early on in anger is enough for many people to not get angry anymore, like or experience a different kind of emotional response. So yeah, getting them to contemplate whether something is just or unjust. I guess it would depend how you did that, but possibly that would, I mean, something similar. I'm not aware of anybody having tried that as a technique. I could see what I usually say to people is when you suggest any coping strategy, you should do something resembling the two column technique and consider what the pros and cons or the strengths and weaknesses of it are. Because any strategy is going to have some pros and cons, right? So the obvious cons of doing that would be that it might encourage rumination, right? And then that might actually contribute to anger potentially. It could backfire as a strategy. Or sometimes when people perceive something as being very unjust and they see injustice as harmful to them, as I mentioned earlier, like that's strongly correlated with people experiencing intense anger. So, if they went in that direction with it, it could fuel their anger. I guess it could be hit and miss in that regard. It would depend how they're thinking about justice. But another thing, I'll give you one more example that when people get angry, they typically shift their focus of attention outward quite dramatically. And there might be reasons for that. In many cases, anger seems more like a coping strategy than a primary emotion. And often, you know, like when you, like for example, Aaron T. Beck, founder of cognitive therapy, said that in virtually every client that he questioned about the nature of their anger, and he did it meticulously, got them to keep records very carefully of their automatic thoughts and so on. He said in almost every case there was another emotion that preceded the anger. So they would get frustrated and then get angry. They'd get their feelings hurt and then they
Sure.
get angry. They get anxious and then they get angry. So anger comes after something else and seems like a coping strategy. Now, those other feelings are typically more introspective, right? So you might think, geez, somebody said something. It really hurt my feelings. So now I'm going to get angry with that jerk and shift all of my attention onto them and why they're such a bad person. But sneakily, by doing that, I'm shifting my gaze away. I'm shifting my attention away from the pain that I was experiencing a moment ago and maybe feelings of shame and self doubt. It's a distraction technique and a way to get angry, right? Because now I'm looking at you, buddy, and it means I'm not
Right.
paying attention to the weakness and vulnerability and pain that you just made me feel internally. It's like a band-aid solution to get angry, like we throw our attention outwards so that we don't have to notice the pain that we're experiencing inside. But that means that almost anything that reallocates more attention internally will tend to disrupt anger. So again, any number of things that you do or questions that you ask yourself that involve not every but many different things that would involve you focusing more attention on yourself again. Well, and also I should say there are different forms of anger, right? So, but typically when you're angry with someone else, if you then start examining like for example, Marcus Aurelius says anger does us more harm. Our own anger does us more harm than the things we're angry about, right?
Right.
Now, that is a beautiful strategy, like for reallocating attention internally, right? That asking yourself that question, does my anger actually harm me more than the thing that Phil just said, than Phil not sending me a Christmas card, right? Or whatever. It was
Right.
maybe me getting angry about it doing me more harm than the fact he hasn't sent me a Christmas card. Like, that's going to force me to now pay more attention to the way that my anger is affecting me. And that very shift in attention will tend to disrupt the process of anger escalating. Like, so it's not a quint like that technique, right? I mean, he's a genius, right? Like, or he's probably standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Loads of other people have maybe just figured out intuitively and through trial and error that asking this sort of question or using this kind of formula will tend to disrupt anger. But there's
Yeah.
far more going on there than it might seem at first. And so, like, would asking yourself whether something's just or unjust, like it could disrupt anger in a number of ways, but it could also backfire and make your anger worse. So I kind of like I suggest that you do a two-column technique and say, is there a good version and a bad version of this strategy, and what would list some of the ways that you could distinguish the good version from the bad version.
Yeah. All right. I like that. We're going to come back to this because I know that's what you're working on right now for what's next. Let's try this one. A bit of a commercial. This is from Sarah. A bit of a
Uh,
commercial, but a timely question. Considering the book as a Christmas gift for family and friends, how might it be useful to the average person? Perhaps with knowledge, blah, blah, blah. Here's the deal. How do I make people read this? That's the question I want to figure out.
I don't know. I honestly like what how could you convince your friends to read this book or that they might be interested in it? It kind of depends what they're into, doesn't it? Like, I mean, I think some people, I would just say, I might say to people, Socrates is the most important thinker in the history of Western philosophy, and yet, like, most people don't know anything about him except that he drank hemlock. I'm simplifying things, but right, you get the
Sure.
idea. And so then if I say that to people, they might go, "Yeah, I guess you're right. I don't really know that much about Socrates, and he does seem like kind of an important dude." Maybe I should know a bit more about him, but is he interesting? Do we know much about him? You might say, actually, we know quite a lot about his life and times, and his story happens to be really dramatic. And, he knew
Right.
some really colorful people. I mean, it's quite not just because I tried to write it this way, but it's quite a cinematic story. Like, even in the classics, like there's a lot of drama and some pretty epic stuff that goes on in his life. So I'd say to people, if you're interested in philosophy, hey, you go right to the horse's mouth and right to the very beginning of it, but aren't many books that present it in, the true drama and color of his life.
Sure.
And so, this is what this book attempts to do.
Yeah. Well, I think people that like to think about their thinking are naturally going to be drawn to this, right? Because as a historic figure, this kind of you're placing the story around the person who changed so much of our thinking about our thinking. Let's put it that way.
And the other thing I think that appeals to people, I mean, I'm just beginning to get feedback from people. So when you write a book, right, I might spend days wrestling over things that I think are controversial, or I'm not sure about, and you kind of always assume that someone's going to go, well, you can't say that thing about Alcibiades, or and you've got to kind of like justify it. And in actual fact, the things that I feel are controversial, nobody ever says anything about, right? It's just one of those weird things about being an author. And the things that people make a fuss about and disagree with a lot are things that I think are self-evident and not controversial, like in many cases, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I forgotten where I was
Is
going with
it
that.
is it kind of like in the absence of stories, people fill in the gaps with their own thinking about one thing or another. And when you kind of declare something that they didn't see otherwise, they they can be it can take a moment for them to put that in their head as an idea that's worth holding on to.
Oh yeah,
I
I know
just
what
I Go
I
ahead.
was going to say what people say that they get from it, right? Is so there's a bunch of things that I thought people might get from it, and just beginning to hear back. And I've noticed a bunch of people already have read it, and I tried to. You'll notice that I don't really explicitly highlight. I could have written a book that was about, hey, look at all the parallels between ancient Athenian politics and modern American politics. It'd be pretty easy to do that, right? But I didn't do that.
Easy.
Yeah, I
Right.
mention it in passing at the beginning and I say, hey, you guys can figure this out for yourself, right? And you might take different things from it. Well,
Right.
a bunch of people already that have read it have said, this looks really weirdly familiar, like from modern
Right.
American politics. They see, and I think it could be that people are Trump voters and read this and think, this is what the Democrats are like. Or there'll be Democrats that read it and think, this is what MAGA is like. I mean, I kind of think people would potentially take different things from it, right?
I,
But
I think that's exactly right.
but one of the things I hope that they would all agree with, and the funny thing is they do agree about this. People on the left and right in politics all feel that there's too much manipulation, deceit, dishonesty, fake news, you know. And the story of Socrates is all about him trying to counter political rhetoric, like, and question the influence of the sophists, basically. So you'll see the thing that people always remember is sometimes just the images that you get in ancient philosophy. And one of them is this image from the Gorgias of the sophist or the rhetorician or the politician, if you like, as being a confectioner who's pandering like to public opinion. He gives them he's only concerned with what sweets taste nice. Like, I
Right.
mean, whether a candy or a sweet is good or bad is just down to whether people will buy more of them and they think they taste nice. He's not interested in whether they're going to make your teeth fall out or not, like
Yeah.
or whether it's good or bad for your health. He doesn't even study, nutrition, like, or
Right.
physiology. Like, he doesn't care about
Well, you
that.
mentioned that as salience earlier, right? The thing is, the
Yeah.
here and now is more salient than some future good. And so this is why we like stuff that's sweet because it's good for us. It feels good right now. So there's one more question I think we want to hit
Mhm.
before we go. And it's really to you, Donald, which is how do you separate your stoicism from your psychotherapy?
How do I separate them? Well, in all honesty, in some ways it's difficult for me because I think one of the things I noticed really early on, and this seems like an odd piece of advice, but I'd give this advice. I used to train and supervise therapists, right?
Right.
Um, so I had to give them a lot of advice when they were starting out and stuff. And, the advice that I would give them, I think, was pretty solid, but it always seemed to be a bit different from what they expected me to say. One of the things I say to them is, look, the your clients behave completely different. The fact is that therapy clients behave completely differently and respond completely differently depending on the context in which you're seeing them and their perception of you. I used to work in schools. I worked with the probation service in South London. I worked with the drugs project. I worked in 3 or 4 South London schools with mainly like 15-year-old kids. A lot of whom had been socially excluded when I first started out, when I was a young guy. And at the same time, I worked in Harley Street. I had a clinic there for many years where I worked with people that were very wealthy and successful, that were radio presenters, actors on TV, high ranking police officers, aristocrats. And, you know, the way also worked in the NHS for a while. Like the way that my clients behaved was totally different depending on whether I saw them in Harley Street or whether I saw
Hmm.
them in a room full of cardboard boxes in a school in South London. Right.
Right.
So and clients, generally speaking, are, I think, easier to work with if they hold the therapist in higher esteem, which is a
Hmm.
shame in a way, right? But it's true that if the therapist has more credibility, and you can earn credibility from your behavior in the sessions, but to some extent, it's also like shaped by people's perception of you before they even meet you. And sometimes that can actually work against you, but I think overall it tends to work in the therapist's favor. Like the client's more likely to do the homework assignments and stuff like that. Now,
Sure. Let me
separating.
just let me put you back to one piece of this, which is from Matthew's question, which I didn't say out loud first,
Uh-huh.
which is, the goal of you as a philosopher, a philosopher's goal might be to have someone act with virtue, whereas the
Right.
goal for psychotherapy is, I think, just to make them whole, right?
No,
No?
no.
Then tell us more.
So what I was going to say is that all of my clients now know that I write books on Stoicism, right?
Hmm.
So, and this started a long time ago, actually. Like, so not a good representation in a sense of what CBT or coaching is normally like, because all my clients are kind of biased and self-selecting by the fact that they know that I write
Gotcha.
books about Stoicism. So I normally, if they didn't know that, it would be difficult for me, I think, to introduce Stoicism to what I was doing. But now I can't, it's difficult for me to avoid talking to them about Stoicism because they've all read my books, right? So they
Right.
bring it up in the sessions, right? So that's just the way that is, and it changes what goes on in the sessions. My clients know too much about me in a sense. Okay, so this is a misconception maybe about psychotherapy. They I think what you mean is like the idea that a lot of people had actually would be slightly different about therapy. So most people assume that therapy is about alleviating emotional suffering, right? You get rid of your anxiety, you get rid of your
Sure.
depression, stuff like that. That idea has always been problematic, and there's always been a kind of sense in which psychotherapists, like from in a number of different ways, have questioned it. But over the past 20 years or so, it's been very directly questioned by third wave cognitive behavioral therapists. And so, in particular, therapists that are influenced by something called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, quite explicitly cast doubt on whether removing, controlling, or eliminating unpleasant feelings should be the primary goal of therapy, because they think that's kind of a trap that clients. There's definitely a lot of
Hmm.
evidence to show that, ironically, but this is a fact. There's so much converging evidence to show this. It's hard to deny, right? That the client's desire to get rid of their anxiety often makes their anxiety worse. I'll give you a really easy example. People with social anxiety, right? So someone has social anxiety disorder. They feel really anxious about being in social situations. Why? Typically because they're worried that other people are going to notice that they look anxious. And so they're ashamed of that, right? And they desperately try and conceal it, and that makes them much more anxious, right? If they didn't care whether people saw them blushing or their hands shaking, if I thought I don't give a monkeys whether I blush, I can care less if
Right.
people see my hands shaking, then I wouldn't really have a problem with social anxiety, right? But ironically, it's the fact that I see it as a problem and I really want to get rid of the symptoms of anxiety that makes it into a pathological problem, right? And causes it to
Right.
escalate, right? So we tend to put more emphasis now on people accepting feelings of sadness and anxiety and so on and kind of riding them out rather than trying to eliminate or control them. Cut a long story short. And so the client's focus now in some forms of therapy, such as behavioral activation, which I mentioned earlier, is more on living in accord with their core values. So I mean, it's hard because this is a big subject, so I'm having to simplify it a lot. But basically, you rather than saying the goal of therapy is to get rid of depression or anxiety, you could say maybe the goal is to live more consistently in accord with your core values, even if sometimes you feel anxious and sometimes you feel kind of sad. Perhaps that's not the end of the world. And what's more important is that you're living consistently in accord with your values. Whereas if you got rid of all your anxiety and depression, but you also abandoned your core values, then what would be the point? Like, it's is maybe the real measure of flourishing would be the extent to which you're doing the stuff that you think is important, like, and not allowing anxiety and depression to become obstacles to doing that. So that's the way that I
Yeah.
would tend to measure progress in therapy and encourage, sometimes that requires a perspective shift for client. But if people are thinking, I think if people assume that therapy is all about getting rid of these emotions, that's a kind of old way of looking at therapy and self-help. I could see that they would imagine that therapy and virtue ethics are kind of at odds with each other, but they're not really, because the goal of most modern therapy is more aligned with living in accord with your values.
All right. Well, what thoughts do we want to leave this room with, right? What do we want to tell people? Hope they enjoy the book, obviously. You always tell people to leave reviews if they can write a good review. What else would you like folks to do?
I think what do I always? I don't really mind if people. It's good if you leave reviews. Sorry, my publisher tell me that you guys should leave reviews, but I don't really mind. I prefer, like, if you just email me and talk to me and ask me questions about it, I'm pretty happy with that, to be honest. But leaving reviews is kind of helpful. If you tell other people about the book, if you give a copy to other people, that's really cool, because it introduces them to some of these ideas. Questioning it, the main thing that I would encourage you to do is, if you have a piece of wisdom, I think one of the main things Socrates gets us to do is to think of the sort of maxims that we would get from the sophists. He calls them the maxims of the wise, and to ask ourselves, are there exceptions to them? Are there pros and cons to this way of thinking? Right? To start thinking of wisdom more as a cognitive skill rather than just a bunch of opinions, right? You won't achieve wisdom or flourishing just by watching a video or reading a book and kind of regurgitating what it says, right? Think of it more as a skill that you have to exercise, that comes from learning to spot contradictions in your thinking and notice exceptions to general rules. And I kind of really emphasize that because, again, modern psychotherapy has raised this concern about rule governed behavior. I haven't talked about that much today, but it's a kind of theme that runs through the book. And yet, I guess something I could say is, a lot of self help books still assume that the goal is to eliminate or control or suppress unpleasant emotions. So the advice that they give is kind of problematic, right? But the other thing that a lot of self-help books do is give people rules of life. Like, the best-selling self-help book of our time is Jordan
Sure.
Peterson's literally 12 Rules of Life, or whatever it's called. And not even that, but in the foreword to that book, he valorizes rigid rule following, which is really odd. It's the complete opposite of what modern behavior therapy tends to do. So you get a lot of simplistic maxims, rigid rules, and simplistic coping strategies from self-help literature. I think that's one of the reasons why people today are drinking from a veritable fire hose of self-improvement advice, and yet nobody seems to have improved all that much as a result, right? We
Yeah.
consume far more self-help content than previous generations did. You used to have to go and buy self-help books from the bookshop or get them from the library, and there were like a few to choose from. Now there's apps, videos, YouTube's full of this stuff. People get bombarded by it. And yet, it doesn't actually seem to have that much impact for some reason. And some of the people that we end up in therapy are among the people consuming the most self-help advice, right? And often they
Yeah.
feel it's benefiting them, but yet they still end up in therapy, right? So to some extent, there's a kind of a risk of illusory benefits, or it's benefiting them in some areas, but not others, right? So I think one of the problems is that we get generic advice from, one way of putting it is, we get generic advice from self-help, and it's not tailored very well to our individual needs or to the demands of different situations. And I hate to break it to you kids, but in order to do that, going to have to do this thing that they call thinking for yourself. God damn it. Right. And
We have to
you
think about our thinking, and we
you're
have to
gonna
do it for ourselves,
you're
and we have
gonna
to
have
ask
to
better questions.
So Jordan Peterson says never always tell the truth or at least never lie. That's one of his rules. And you're going to have to think, is that a good idea when my wife asks me, do I look fat in this? Or is it a good idea, like when your kids try and ask you what you got them for Christmas? Or is it a good idea when your friend wants to kill himself because he's suicidal and depressed and he asks you where like you hid his dagger or something, to borrow Socrates' example, right? So
Right.
you're going to have to use discernment and judgment and be sensitive to the demands of different situations. Like, and that's a cognitive skill that comes from practicing, right? Learning rules and then trying to apply what we call verbal rules does the opposite. It typically makes people more rigid in their coping style, and that's what usually gets them in problems. So the very nature of self-help advice is problematic. The generic nature,
Yeah.
what causes people problems? Following overly rigid rules or maxims in life. Why do they do that? Because they look to generic advice from self-improvement influencers. This guy says you should always speak the truth. So that's what I'm going to do next time I talk to my wife. Like maybe what you should do is look closely at your wife's face, and like look out for subtle cues in her behavior and
Right.
adapt what you're saying to the cues that you're seeing, as well as your own certain values that you think are a priority in life and stuff like that. You're gonna have to think for yourself to do that, though, and maybe
Yeah.
behave differently. And there might be different times of the day or different situations where you might have to employ different rules or different strategies, rather than just kind of try and follow the same rule all the time. That's
Yeah.
normal human behavior, Phil. Right? Like
Right.
normally we observe situations and kind of adapt our coping style to them on the fly. But when we turn to self-improvement influencers and books, what we're typically looking for is a kind of, what's the expression, a kind of one size fits all, like kind of generic advice. And that the very rigidity of that is perhaps one of the core causes of our problem.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I'd
I
get
think
people to question the pros and cons of different self-help advice and strategies.
Yeah, I think that's it. In this place, I mean, I think one of the things that would be fun, you talk, well, the publisher says you want reviews and all. I think all of that is great. And hopefully people will both read the book and tell their friends about it. But
Yeah.
I think a thing is here that you get the most out of is to have people read the book and then go use the book, right? Go out
Yeah.
there and think and try these ideas out for themselves and find out what works for them and what are the pros and cons of thinking like Socrates. That's what
What are
people
the
can
pros?
find out
That's
for
a good
themselves.
question. What are the pros and cons of thinking that? See, in some ways, it's quite simple. Like I'd put it that way. When I teach coping skills, particularly to groups of people, one of the first things I'll do is I'll go, here's a relaxation technique for coping with chronic pain, for example, right? I go, what do you think the pros and cons are of using this technique? What do you think might be a good way and a bad way of doing it? Are there situations where it might be more suitable and ones where it would be less appropriate,
Great.
right? And just getting people to that's all. It's just like a tiny additional step, that adds in more nuance. But if that step's missing, like then people are much less likely to benefit from it. Exactly like you say. You could just look at this book and go, what are the pros and cons of following the advice in this book? What are the pros and cons of thinking more like Socrates? And there are good and bad ways of taking everything. Socrates does give people maxims and sayings, and then he'll say things and then question it himself at a later in another dialogue, like at a later point. But so I think he thinks the maxims of the sophists are valuable, right? But only if we handle them in the right way. Like apparently Aristotle, one of the Stoics, one of the controversial Stoic, who may have been influenced by Socrates, said the thing about moral precepts, like the Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules of Life, are that wise people use them wisely and foolish people use them foolishly. So
Yeah.
the trick would be to take generic advice like that and figure out how to actually use it wisely in a way that's, to use the technical term that's sometimes used in research in this area, in a way that's sensitive to changes in the environment.
Yeah. There's so much there. All right. I'm trying to tie a bow on this for you.
Let's tie a bow on.
Yeah. Thank you to everybody who's been part of the audience.
Thanks,
And yes,
everyone.
there are recordings, and we will get that sent to you. Thank you for being here.
And thank you, Phil, for giving your time to help us out today on this joyous occasion, celebrating the the birth, the second and final installment in the How to Think series, perhaps.
They don't even have a, I mean, is there a
There might be a
two-book
third one.
series? What's that called?
I
I
know.
know, but it's the middle of a trilogy, or is it the increasingly, how did Douglas Adams say, the increasingly poorly named trilogy, right? The fourth book in the increasingly poorly named trilogy. But in this case, it's two books in a trilogy.
Yeah, it's a geology or something. I don't know what it's called.
Yeah, I don't know what
But
that, there it is. I think it is duology, but don't
geology.
think I've ever heard anybody use that. It just means two words, right? Super. All right. Thank you all. I'll stop recording.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.